So let's try to begin. I'd like to welcome everybody this evening at our regular meeting of the Princeton-Bucharest Virtual Seminar in Early Modern Philosophy. The topic for tonight is experiments on light, Bacon's experiments on light and the 17th century followers of Bacon on experiments on light. And we will have 3 talks. Our first speaker is Doina-Cristina Rusu from the University of Groningen, and the title of her talk is Subtlety and Experiments of Light. Doina, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Dana. Thank you, the organizers, for always making sure that we have some nice activity on Tuesday. For me, evening, for some of them, morning or lunch. It's really great to be at the Princeton-Bucharest seminar again after many editions in person, finally a virtual edition. So I thought I will go the first, and I thought I should maybe say something about the term experiments of light. That will only take a minute. So in several places, Bacon makes the distinction between experiments of light and experiments of fruit. The first are used to discover the causes of the visible phenomena, intermediary causes, final causes, it doesn't matter, it's in general, it's used for discovery, while the experiments of fruit are used for production. The way I see this distinction, in many cases, the same experiment can be used for both light and fruit. So it depends whether the experimenter wants to look into the causes of the phenomena or there is something in the experiment that can be used for production. Some other experiments can also be just of light or of fruit. But then again, for others, it's a question of how you want to make use of the experiment. And for the experiment, of light, I thought that maybe the best place to start looking at it is a place where Bacon is talking in particular about the discovery of causes. And this is the instances of special powers, in particular, the summoning instances. And Bacon says, and the problem is that I don't see my own quotation because I see people on the screen. And I have no idea what to do with that.
There's an option on the right-hand side where you have the gallery view to pick just one window as opposed to many windows, and then you only see 1 or 2 people.
Okay. Okay. Sorry again. So in these instances of special power, Bacon says they take their name for the language of the law courts because they summon things to appear which have not appeared before. I also call them evoking instances, and their role is to reduce the imperceptible to the perceptible. And there are 2 important things here. So first, Bacon uses in Latin the terms non-sensible and sensible. I would prefer this translation. I took the official Oxford Francis Bacon quotation for this presentation, but I think it's important because for Bacon, perception is a technical term and is distinct from sensation. But whenever you see perception in this case, it will mean sense perception. The second really important thing is that Bacon talks about deducing non-sensible to sensible. And this language of reducing or deducing, it's especially used by Bacon when he mentions this idea of the sensible and non-sensible and how we can make full use of the senses. And I will just show you another place also in the Novum Organum, where he talks about senses, and he uses deduction again, and he talks again about senses and experiments and the subtlety of nature. And this is going to be the first part of the presentation. So Bacon says to remedy these defects of the senses, in order to, he gathered helps for the sense in order to make good what is lacking and put right to what deceives. And I do this not so much with instruments as by experiments. For the subtlety of experiments is far greater than that of the senses itself, even when it has precise instruments to help it. In fact, I set little store by the immediate and peculiar perception of the sense, but carry the matter to the point where the sense judges only the experiment, whereas the experiment judges the thing. And then he calls himself a high priest of the sense. So what is very important in this quotation is, first of all, his discussion on subtlety. So there is the subtlety of nature, the subtlety of experiments, and the subtlety of senses. Among all these, the subtlety of the senses is the less subtle one. And in order to be able to capture the subtlety of nature, Bacon says we have to use experiments, which are more subtle than senses. And the reference there where he says that there are instruments that help the senses. So in the Novum Organum, right before the aphorism on summoning instances, there is another aphorism where he talks about instruments and helping the senses. And Bacon makes an important distinction between helping the senses in the sense of just making them better, so microscope and telescope, and helping the senses to actually see what is not sensible at all, what cannot be in any ways made visible or touchable, but which can nevertheless be deduced. And this is precisely where he explains that. So he sets more summoning instances. There are 7 kinds. That's less important. What I want to look at are the 3rd and the 4th types of this reduction, which is first when the object is incapable of making an impression upon the senses, and when the size of the object will not let the impression be carried to the sense. And the importance of these 2 situations is, as Bacon says, and you can see it on the screen, that this reduction touches on very many matters and should be everywhere sought out in our investigation into things. It is evident that air, spirits, and such like things which are fine and subtle in their entirety cannot be seen or felt, so that reductions are absolutely necessary when inquiring into them. And he goes on and he says, so we can see this mostly in the motion of spirits, which are enclosed in tangible bodies. And every tangible body here with us contains an invisible and intangible spirit, which overlays and, as it were, closes. From this source arises that powerful and marvelous threefold process of the spirit in the tangible body. And again, so I want to focus on these instances because it's a really universal process that he's talking about. Everything is done through the spirits. And I know there are quite a lot of Baconians around. There is a lot of literature, especially lately, about spirits in Bacon and the importance of spirits in experimentation. And what he also says here is that there are 3 main processes of the spirit. One is when the spirit leaves the body and the tangible matter dries up. when it stays inside and then softens and liquefies it. And then when the spirit is neither emitted nor wholly held back. And then we have putrefaction. And if the conditions are right, we can even see vivification. So the spirit starts to shape the matter, produces organs, assimilates, works upon, and organizes it. But these are just the general processes in nature. Another instance of the same reduction of bodies can be seen in the mixture. And you have here the quotation. So it's the very same aphorism in the Novum Organum. And he says, let's have a look at the mixture of bodies. So that bodies contain in the way of water, oil, spirit, ash, salt, and such like, or what, so to give an example, what milk contains in the way of butter, curds, whey, and so on. Now, as far as tangible bodies are concerned, these things are made perceptible by artificial and expert separations. And he says somewhere else that this is already done to a certain extent by the alchemists, so it's a bit less important to look at it. However, and this is what it is in red, the nature of the spirit in them, though it cannot be made directly perceptible, can still be apprehended by the various motions and stresses of tangible bodies in the rustings, in their pugnancies and rustings, and the different colors, smell, and taste of the same bodies after separation. So what is important here is that, again, Bacon is not really interested in separating the tangible parts, but he's looking at the specific kind of mixture, which is the mixture of spirits with tangible matter. It's also not a mixture of spirits only. He discusses this in another part in the Novum Organum, what kind of mixtures are possible when we talk only about pneumatics. Here is really about tangible and pneumatic. And the idea is, because tangible matter is passive and inert, whenever we see something happening, we know it's because the spirits are moving inside the matter. And from there, and from the different colors, smells, and tastes, we can actually infer what kind of activity was done by the spirits. So this might seem very alchemical, and I'm not doubting that it is. I actually think the influence on alchemy, the influence of alchemy on Bacon is been overlooked. But the quotation continues with a criticism exactly of alchemy, and in particular distillations, which by many alchemists were presented as separations. But then Bacon says that they are doing this not by imitating or emulating nature, but by destroying with fierce, there should be heat, or excessively vigorous virtues, every subtler schematism in which the occult virtues and consents of things mainly reside. So, at least in what has to do with separating some particular bodies in a mixture, he's unhappy with this kind of vexing nature. It's not that he's altogether opposed to that. Of course, Bacon uses heat quite a lot, and experiments like that are really taken to an extreme. But in this case, he thinks that the biggest error of alchemists were to think that the final results are actually just the elements of the body separated, when in fact are just new things that have been added either by heat or by other things that combined during the experimentation. And he gives the example of the vapor towards the end of the first paragraph. And he says it's not like the vapor has been separated from the water when it's boiling, but it was actually created from the water by the fire's heat. So we have to really take care of, when we have an experiment, what is in the beginning, what we add, and what we have at the end. And in this particular case of mixtures and separation, we have to make sure that we don't add things in the middle. And then he says that in the same way, it is possible to test pure, impure, the better from the grosser. So again, it sounds very alchemical, and I think it is. And now I'm gonna just quickly say something about the separation and subtle matter. So I think separation has been quite overlooked in the Baconian studies. And I think one of the reasons of this is that, in a way, it is a precondition for other processes. And scholars focus more on the other process than on the initial separation. And I think it's a precondition for rarefaction and condensation, concoction, maturation and alimentation, desiccation, putrefaction and vivification, transmission of spirits. For instance, in the case of alimentation, in the Abecedarium Novum Naturae, Bacon is quite clear that it's a compound motion, but it's actually compound of other compounds motions, and one of them is separation. Moreover, if you recall the passage here about the three main processes of the spirits, they all have to do with the separation of spirit. So what happens when the spirit leaves, but what happens when it stays in and moves in a particular way? And to this I will come back because it's really important. And then, of course, in putrefaction and vivification, part of it has to escape and part of it to stay. So it is, again, a separation, at least of part of the spirit. And it's also related to the transmission of spirits in general. So that means sounds, smells, but also transmission of spirits in the, let's call them magical instances. So when we have fascination or other kinds of work of imagination upon other imaginations. Why I think separation is very relevant is because it shows the limits of transformations of pneumatic matter into tangible, so we can see to what extent they can be separated, and vice versa, as well as of watery into oily, and vice versa. And this is something, so these transformations are all over Bacon's works. And what I find relevant is that it uncovers, as I say here, the limits of volatile and fixed. So not everything can be transformed into everything. And that's not only in the sense that a stone cannot become air, it cannot even become air through various transformation, everything done by degrees. There might be some parts of that stone that are too fixed to become volatile. So if there is an end of the world, which is probably not, it wouldn't necessarily be only volatile matter, though the universe in principle has this tendency, so it's a very Stoic idea, but there might still remain a core of tangible matter. And we can find that in what is fixed and cannot be made volatile through separations. And again, I think this is something that should be looked at in particular because volatile and fixed will become very important in the history of chemistry after Bacon. in discussions with experiments on acids, salts, alkalis. And I have here in mind, in particular, Van Helmont and Boyle. Boyle wrote a book on the quality of volatile. And I think Bacon's place in the history of chemistry could be established if we look precisely at these things. Another important thing, so in some of the experiments that I will show you in a second, these kind of separations can reveal different degrees of subtlety of spirits. And for the rest of the time, I will look at a few examples and what I wrote here. So this hypothesis or several hypotheses will be illustrated. This is a definition from the Abecedarium Novum Naturae. It's not that important. So for instance, Silva silvarum starts with filtration and percolation. And after two examples, Bacon says, well, actually, just to make it clear for everyone, percolation or transmission or straining is a good kind of separation. Not only of thick from thin and gross from fine, but of more subtle natures. And this is precisely what we want to look at. And varies according to the body through which the transmission is made. So it depends if you use a woolen bag, because then the liquor will leave the fatness. If it is sand, it will leave the saltness. And this is how we produce sweet water, fresh water. And then he says there is also a possibility to sever wine from water, passing it through ivy wood, but I didn't do it still. So this would be one kind. What comes up in the experiments you have here? So first, let's look at the experiment. The clarifying of liquors by adhesion is an inward percolation and is effected when some cleaving body is mixed and agitated with the liquors, whereby the grosser parts of the liquor stick to that cleaving body, and so the finer parts are freed from the grosser. And apothecaries use whites of eggs to clarify things. In other parts, he explains that some very clear liquors are like that because the fine spirit is indeed separated from the grosser spirit, and the finer spirit is more shiny. We know that because of the light and because of the fire. So light and shiny and finer and finer are connected. So this is a kind of inward percolation, and to this I was referring when I mentioned maturation. Bacon says in century 4 of the same Silva that maturation and clarification are very similar processes, and he has a lot of experiments with separation in these cases. And in some of them, you can clarify something by, for instance, either manipulating the spirits in such a way as to go to the extremes or as to go to the bottom, or depends if you want to make the finer spirits do something or the grosser one so that you let the finer, in any case. So this is something that maybe one wouldn't think, that if the spirit doesn't leave the body, properly speaking, is a separation. But for Bacon it is, because the spirit really passes through another body, which is the body of the liquid, and moves to another place where someone wants to take it for some reasons. Another example are infusions. And this is, I think, a good illustration of why separation has been overlooked. Because in infusion, we would mainly focus on the result and on the decoction. and less on the separation. But what happens, it's actually that, as Bacon says, in bodies containing fine spirits, which do easily dissipate when you make infusion, the rule is a short stay of the body in the liquor receives the spirit, and the longer stay confounds it because it draws forth the earthly part. And then he talks about an error made by physicians, which consider that a longer stay of, let's say, a herb would increase the virtue. But this is not the case, because the finer spirits are actually anyways leaving the body initially, and after that, only the more gross ones. So in this sense, I mentioned that you can see different types of subtleties. And the way to actually really make the liquid stronger in spirits is not by letting it more time, but to repeat the infusion of the body often. And then he takes an example, violets, infuse them in a quart of vinegar, let them stay 3/4 of an hour, and take them forth and refresh the infusion with like quantity of new violets 7 times. And it will make a vinegar so fresh of the flower as if 12 months after it be brought to you in a saucer, you shall smell it before it come to you. And the next experiment that I have here is one, again, in which he's checking how much time you should leave certain bodies, because of course not all the bodies are the same. In principle, it happens that the finer parts are leaving first, and that's because the body which they leave has some fine pores. If you let them stay longer, the pores will probably become bigger, and then other parts of the spirit will also leave, the grosser parts. But depending on the body, you might actually want to have the grosser parts. So in between these 17 and 21 experiments, he has several instances in which the same plant, because it's about plants, can be used with completely different purposes in medicine, depending whether you let it stay a bit or longer. So it can be the case that you actually want the virtue that is in the grosser spirits, and then you have to keep it longer. But what's happening in these experiments, he really wants to compare. So to see which of them issue more speedily, which more slowly. And so by apportioning the time, you can take and leave that quality which you desire. And I think I should stop here. So these were, as I said, a few illustrations of the separation. Also, you can see that indeed the way in which we know that something happened to the spirits is the difference between the body, both bodies, so the one from which the spirit left and the new body in which the spirit entered, change some of the qualities, sensory qualities. And I hope I convinced you that separation is more important than it has been stated until now. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any image with any kind of separation of subtle matter because it's subtle and unseen. But for all the Baconians, I have an image with how wine and water can be separated because I made it for a workshop. So it's my separation of wine and water. But these are two tangible bodies, so they don't really count. Thank you.
Thank you, Doina. I just want to remind everyone that questions will be at the end, but do ask questions in the chat. So thank you again, Doina. And let's move to the next talk tonight. Our next speaker is Alexandru Liciu from the University of Bucharest. And his talk is entitled Robert Hooke's Ways of Discovery, a Baconian Legacy. So let's move from Bacon to Hooke.
Yes,
Alex, you have.
thank you, Diana, and thank you to all the organizers of this very nice series of conferences. Thank you, Professor Garber and Claudia, for having me here tonight. I'm going to try to share my screen, but please note if you can see it, because I have two screens, and I'm not sure how this is supposed to work. So let's see.
Seems to be working perfectly.
Okay, but it's not in full screen, right?
Yeah, you have to.
I have to do something. Let's see. F5. Just no. Okay, I'm not sure what's happening.
Nothing happened. Try the right-hand side screen. There is somewhere in the lower.
No, there's not. That's not what should happen. One minute. Yeah. So you cannot see the full screen presentation of my PowerPoint.
Not yet, but did you press the?
Yes, I do, but it just for some reason it goes full screen in my other screen.
I see.
So maybe if I just change the text with the PowerPoint presentation. Let's see if this works. Just 1 second. Stop share. Okay.
Yeah, all sorts of skills.
Yeah, I'm sorry for this.
Don't worry. Yeah.
Okay, and I just went through this again. What can you see now? It's my. Is the PowerPoint now? Can you see my PowerPoint now?
PowerPoint still not full screen.
Okay. How about now?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And I'm sorry for this. Okay. So I'm not going to be able to look at the camera because I have to read from my other screen. So how do I? Okay. So Hooke and Bacon have been brought together in a number of scholarly papers on the use of experiments of light. Claudia Domitu, for instance, has investigated the way in which Hooke elaborated on Bacon's concept of instantia crucis. Peter Anstey took this demarche one step further and claimed that the crucial experiments, alongside other experiments of light and other types of experiment, like the experiments in consort, are essential to what he calls the Bacon-Boyle-Hooke, or the BBH account of the philosophy of experiment. However, I believe that other details concerning the precise way in which Hooke drew on Bacon's experiments of light are still to be spelled out. For this, I propose to look at Hooke's ways of discovery that, I claim in this presentation, bear a telling similarity with Bacon's prerogative instances. But this is very much a work in progress, and I'm very much waiting for your suggestions. Hooke posthumously published Present State of Natural Philosophy, which draws on his earlier things requisite to a natural history, has generally been seen as the place where the author shows a form of Baconianism at its best. Probably the first to have made this connection is William Wheeler, in his Philosophy of Inductive Sciences. Writing a state-of-the-art of past knowledge, suggestively entitled Review of Opinions on Knowledge, Wheeler claims that Hooke's, I quote, essay might be looked upon as an attempt to adapt the Novum Organum to the age which succeeded its publication. In Wheeler's view, Hooke shares with Bacon's the promise of obtaining scientific truths when facts have been duly accumulated. Hooke follows in Bacon's footsteps not only when it comes to the advancement of knowledge, but also errs in the same way. I quote, he follows Bacon also in the error of attempting at once to obtain from facts the discovery of a nature instead of investigating the laws of phenomena. The shortcomings of Weaver's interpretation have been tackled in the 70s by David Oldroyd, for which Hooke furthered Bacon's method by a more detailed account of the, of the role of hypothesis. For Oldroyd, Hooke had a much clearer idea than did Bacon of the importance of so-called hypothetical deductive methods in science. According to this interpretation, the philosophical algebra has two parts, I quote, the first dealing with the correction of data, the second with methods for dealing with the material thus corrected. However, a central misunderstanding of both accounts just discussed is, I believe, that they do not spell out what the correction of data in Oldroyd's case or facts in Weaver's case mean. This is one aspect of what I will try to elucidate in this talk by focusing on a hitherto undiscussed connection between the present state of natural philosophy and the new organon. So just very briefly refer to the structure of the present state, which starts with a series of examples of provisional natural histories, many of which are actually artificial histories, and with the claim that, at first, these do not need to be especially Luciferous. However, Hooke's story changes as the natural histories become more and more complex, ending up with 36 instances of Luciferious material, which Hooke entitles Ways of Discovery. So in what follows, I will try to suggest that Hooke's Ways of Discovery are drawn on Bacon's instances with special power that concludes the second book of the Novum Organum. So these are the Ways of Discovery are divided into two sections. These are the more secret ways of discovery, which are only 3, and I'm not going to deal with them just now. And these are some of the others, which are 29th or something like this. But we can come back to this. So for this I want to discuss 3 examples. The first example. Firstly, Bacon's solitary and migratory instances, so the first 2 of the prerogative instances, are connected by Hooke with 2 of his ways of discovery. Bacon's solitary instances deal with the one and only feature that unites 2 subjects, or the one and only feature that separates them. As examples, Bacon speaks of colors. Prisms have nothing in common with the colored objects, flowers, gems, etc., except that they all deal somehow with colors. In the first case, I'm quoting for Bacon, color is nothing else than a modification of the image of light sent out and received by different angles of coincidence, while in the second case, the color arises out of the textures and schematism of the various bodies. Conversely, different variations of the same species of flower, for instance, will be identical except for the color. The migratory instances, Bacon continues, will deal with the changes, for instance, generation, privation, majoration, or minoration, in the aforementioned properties. For example, in the case of whiteness, we observe that broken glass becomes white from transparent. The crushing of glass, as Bacon puts it, introduced and carried the form of whiteness. But only apparently, because with the help of prerogative instances, we are able to see that the whiteness is due to an equal refraction of light rays. So it is refraction from the different pieces of glass. We should also note that the motions of majoration and minoration, which is to say that an object can be more or less white. Now there is one very important difference between the 2 types of instances. The first type serves as a first step towards the exclusive process, which is the part of the method that cuts off digression and keeps the mind on the right track. On the other hand, the migratory instances present the danger of appearing as an affirmative instance, and this is why it has to be corroborated with other types of special powers. The same mechanism is employed by Hooke in his first way of discovery that you can partially see on the screen. So this way of discovery deals with, I am quoting, how nature proceeds in generating, increasing, weakening, and destroying the same properties in several states of the same body. The example discussed by Hooke is greenness. The most perfect green is apparently connected with the most perfect state of a plant. Afterwards, the green turns more and more towards yellow and then towards red. Now, in the vein of the experiments of Wright, Hooke actually sees in this something different, namely an inquiry into the nature of liquidity and moisture. So green is a sign of liquidity, while yellow is a sign of dryness and sulfurousness. But then the story becomes even more complicated, since the chart of colors does not coincide with what we observe in metals, from which we find out that the yellowness is correlated with thinness, while red and purple are related to thickness. Behind this lies, again, an investigation into the property of moisture. This time, in the case of metals, yellowness is correlated with moisture and not with dryness, as it was the case for plants. As for the solitary instances, they are akin to Hooke's sixth way of discovery that you can partially see on the screen. So this way of discovery aims to find by what ways nature produces the same effect in diverse bodies. One of the examples discussed by Hooke is the same that was chosen by Bacon, the one of color. The question is similar to Bacon's. We are asked whether the colors in the rainbow, in triangular crystal and gems, in bubbles and planted bodies, in flowers, wood, leaves, stones, etc., can be all reduced to the same principle of transparency and refraction. However, this is where Hooke decides to go against Bacon. If for the latter, this prerogative instance serves to distinguish between optical effects and the textures of matter, for the former, so for Hooke, it served to hint towards the unified principle of color that comes from optics. Another example, my second example, would relate Bacon's indicative and clandestine instances with Hooke's 14th way of discovery. Bacon's indicative instances deal with the fact that, I'm quoting, everybody is capable of taking many compound forms of nature in its concrete state. They check, depress, break, and tie up one another so that they mask the individual forms. Then how do we find out the individual forms? Bacon states that in some bodies it is more visible than in others. It stands out above the rest in its vigor, either by absence of impediment or by predominance of its virtue, and aims at the nature under investigation naked and substantive, and also in its exaltation or highest degree of potency, as Bacon puts it. This is why those instances are related to Bacon's first vintage. Although again, we are warned against the danger of confirmation, and we are advised to follow a strict and careful exclusive process. One example here is, in the case of heat, the air in a calendar glass, since the motion of expansion is part of the form of heat. Other bodies, like a flame or some boiling water or a piece of hot iron, etc., are unable to properly display the motion of expansion because it would disappear too quickly. While, I'm quoting, calendar glass clearly shows up a plain, progressive expansion of air, which lasts instead of passing away. And the other example is, of course, quicksilver that serves as an indicative instance for weight. The converse of this instance with special power are Bacon's clandestine instances. If the indicative ones deal with the highest degree of potency, the clandestine ones treat of the lowest degree. For example, the case of the qualities of determinate or consistent, seen as the opposite of liquid or flowing. The bubble of water is a liquid body which has consistency as a latent or hidden quality. The same is the case for snow or froth, which are consistent although they are formed from liquid bodies. Or melted metals, which become rather consistent or cringy, even though they are liquids. For such an instance, we find out that the notion of liquid and consistent are actually only vulgar notions based on our senses, says Bacon, and that what really happens is that all bodies have a tendency to preserve continuity, although this is weaker in liquids and stronger in solids. So the same happens with the example of attraction between bodies. Not only the lodestone, but also the wood and the iron have attractive powers, although they are rather dormant or latent. This investigation to the degrees of potency is taken up by Hooke in this passage, in his 14 way of discovery, which works, I'm quoting, by observing the concomitant properties of individuals in the greatest of highest and in the lowest pitch of the perfections or existences. His example is a physiological one and deals with the humidum radicale, the radical moisture of the organism, responsible with our capacity of moving or the animal motion. The radical moisture reaches its maximum of concoction in our adulthood and its minimum in our old age, when it turns into a stony substance and impedes our movements. In the style of mechanical philosophy, Hooke proposes an analogy with a clock. Just like a clock needs to be oiled, a baby is at first unable to move because his bones are too soft, but still has the radical moisture that will come into play once the child grows. And like the humidum radicale, a worn clock's oil will eventually turn, I'm quoting, thickened with dust and filth and almost to stop the motion. Hooke's point, however, is that this way of inquiry is an alternative and a shortcut to a more specialized knowledge. Someone who does not possess any previous knowledge about watches might still find something about them if they inquire into watches using the method of degrees of potency. As Hooke puts it, these things, which are the common accidents of watches, are very easy to be found by a diligent observer, though altogether ignorant of watches, and by comparing the several accidents one with another, he may at last be able to understand a watch thoroughly and know wherein the goodness or badness of one consists. Continuing the analogy, the same goes for the human body. You are able to inquire into the nature of the human body by looking at the transmissions of the degrees of potency of different qualities. And I'm quoting here, may one that is wholly ignorant of the fabric of any natural body be able to learn the nature of it by observing the several accidents that happen to it in the several states and conditions of it. And I'll have just one more example if I still have time. So yet another example is Bacon's triad monadic, deviating, and frontier instances, which are used by Hooke in his 11th, 12th, and 13th ways of discovery. Bacon's monadic instances deal with the apparent marvelous species or magnalia naturae, but which, as it will turn out, can actually be subsumed and comprehended by some form or certain law, so that we are able to see that the regularity came from a fine difference. As examples, Bacon gives the lodestone among stones, quicksilver among metals, the elephant amongst quadrupeds, and so on and so forth. The principal law given to these instances is that they fight against our custom way of thinking. The deviating instances are very similar to the monadic ones, except they deal with particulars and not with species. And actually, we could find many more examples of monstrous individuals than of deviating species. The last element of the triad are the frontier instances, which have to do with what seems to be interspecific, which is something that is between two different species, like bats, which are sort of intermediate species between birds and quadrupeds. So I believe that Hooke mimics closely this tripartition, also proposing three elements. And in this passage, you can see the first. The first of them works by, I'm quoting, taking notice of all such experiments and accidents as show the frustrations and failings of nature. Such observations share with Bacon's instances the role of assistant to the mind. It does not let us get accustomed to a dogmatic way of thinking. And I'm quoting, for all such experiments as these circumstances being diligently noted afford very essential distinctions and do very much direct, circumscribe, and limit the minds in its reach. Examples of this might be as follows. We observe that water extinguishes fire. Then we can formulate a query and ask whether this is due to water's coldness or to its moisture. It is quite clear that it's not due to water's coldness, since boiling water will also extinguish the fire. But what seems to be anomalous is that neither the moisture of water seems to be responsible for extinguishing the fire, since if it had been, then aqua vitae would also have extinguished it as well, and we know that this is not the case. Then we should further query whether it is not the absence of air that actually extinguishes the fire, and this is how we learn from nature erring. A second instance that again we can partially see here, invoked by Hooke, is the one that deals with observing the deviation of nature in framing specific bodies. The same motif for the helps of the mind is used again, as Hooke writes, I'm quoting, these though in themselves they seem at first to amaze and perplex the mind, yet when by diligent examination and inquiry the veil that covers them is removed, and it be discovered to which of the more common operations of nature it belongs, and wherein it differs from them, then does it as a former highly assist the judgment in determining the true nature of the principle by manifesting what great influence these or those accidents or concurrents had in altering or disguising it, so as to make it appear somewhat extraordinary or miraculous. One example is similar to Bacon's, the lodestone again. Only apparently miraculous, the lodestone can be explained and also augmented or diminished using mechanical principles. The diamond that glows in the dark is also only apparently miraculous, and what it actually does is to reject all the supposition already formulated on the nature of light, and to show that the only essential property of light is a very quick vibrative motion. Such experiments, therefore, have the role of eliminating all of the wrong hypotheses that we held so far, and which could not have been removed, save before looking at the apparently miraculous side of nature. In Hooke's very vivid imagery, I'm quoting, such experiments as these do hugely strengthen the discursive faculty and enables it to cut off all those numerous heads of Hydra, which when cut off one by one do afresh spring up again and create new and greater difficulties. But by watching nature and taking hold of this opportunity of the deviations of it, the victory becomes easy and speedy. So the last element of the analogies that I wanted to suggest is Hooke's ways of discovery by taking notice of all such productions of nature as are differing from the rest of the same species, which is also on the screen. Even if they are truly esteemed monstrous and wonderful by the generality, a philosophical historian has somewhat else to do than admire them, says Hooke. Therefore, the natural historian should be someone trained in the field of the given anomaly so that they would be able to distinguish the important details from the bulk of useless material. I'm quoting, so that it is not everyone that can be presently fit for this undertaking, but it requires a long and sinuous endeavor and accustoming oneself to observe the methods and courses of nature. without which endeavor it is much to be feared that the history so written will be full stuffed with impertinences and contain very little of anything solid, material, and useful. Okay, so I think I need to conclude. So these are some tentative conclusions. So to sum up, in this presentation, I suggested that Hooke's ways of discovery that conclude his present state of natural philosophy are imitating and drawing on Bacon's instances with special power, which end the latter's Novum Organum. However, much more still needs to be done, and many more other examples need to be discussed in order to substantiate the working hypothesis that I just proposed to you. Moreover, I believe that the ways of discovery, if further investigated, can shed light on the notion of Baconian fact that Hooke used to work with, since I suppose it would be more closely related to the Baconian prerogative instances. And one other telling similarity between the two projects that still needs to be further investigated is the fact that Hooke's démarche is essentially unfinished or even unfinishable. Hooke emphasized that up to this point he spoke as a historian and not as a philosopher. The ways of discovery, no matter how different, reveal causes which are not extremely different from their effects. The discovery of the innermost laws of nature is a job for the philosopher, and to this job Hooke intended to return in his second part of his philosophical algebra, which he never perfected. And this was it. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. As I said, we are going to do questions at the end. So thanking Alex again, let's move to the next talk, last talk today. Hanna Szabelska is going to talk about Jean-Baptiste Hamel on induction. Hanna.
Thank you very much for accepting my proposal. Can you hear me well?
Because yes, we do.
In the beginning. Okay, wonderful.
We also see you, which is a good.
I would like to. Yeah, I made some progress. Okay. And can you see the picture, my screen?
We do see the slides, but you need to make it full screen.
How to do this?
You have the option present. I think that's it. On the right-hand side here.
Okay. Okay. Oh, sorry. Record present.
Next to share, I think there is the option present. Maybe that's the one.
Next to share. Okay. Just a minute. It's very frustrating. It could be perhaps left, or don't you see it very well?
We do see the image.
It's on the upper right.
Hanna, it's you have a yellow share here, and next to the yellow share, you have something called present.
Yeah.
Can you try that? Just click there.
Yellow share.
Next to your picture, on the right, you see your small profile picture.
No idea. I do apologize.
No, so go to the right. You're now on the left, right? Yeah,
Okay.
and then down in the Google Doc page, it says present in like a square.
Mm-hmm.
You're very close to it. Just a bit up.
Okay, yeah, I got it. Oh, okay. And now I'm stuck.
No, you pressed on file for some reason, but you need to go in on the opposite side, on the right.
Ah, yeah. Okay, yeah.
Yeah, there. Maybe it will work.
I see it. Yes. Yeah, maybe simply my Google isn't working fast. Yeah, present. I can see now. Okay. So I oh no. Okay. I think it should be working. Interpreting.
Hanna, we have a problem with sound.
Okay.
We hear you very badly. Maybe you want to turn your camera and just leave the sound on so that we can hear you better.
Yeah, okay, yeah, it's good. Yeah, it's good. I have technical problems today.
If the presentation is now working, one option would be to download it as a PDF and show us the PDF.
Yeah, yeah. Just a minute. I'll stop video. Okay, and now can you hear me better?
Yes.
Yes, now it's better. The sound is better.
Oh, okay, wonderful. Yeah, okay. And now I have to return to slides. Anyway, I can post the link to the slide. So just in case. So interpreting by Henri Stellem, Colbert Present, avec le membre de la Royal des Sciences. On the left, we can see please that respectfully bows to the sound. And just a moment, I would like to post my link to the Google Docs. That's awful. No, it simply doesn't work. Sorry.
Could you open it? Could you open it again and just scroll down in your presentation without making it full screen?
Yeah, okay.
There is
Yeah,
the last option, Hanna, is to send us the file, and we just watch. I mean, send it as an attachment, and then each of us can just open it on our computer while you are just talking. How about that?
Just a moment. I set it open to everybody with a link, so it should work. Okay.
Okay, so everybody has now the link, Google link. So please do open your file.
Yeah,
open
yeah.
and then can talk to us. And we will manage somehow.
In the painting, yeah, this is the picture on the slide too. In the painting by Henri Stellem, Colbert Present à Louis XIV, le membre de l'Académie Royale. On the left, we can see a priest that respectfully bows in the direction of the sovereign Louis XIV. This is Jean-Baptiste Hamel, whom Colbert appointed the first perpetual secretary of the newly founded Royal Academy of Sciences. The slide 3. This is a passage from the encomium by Fontenelle, Eloge de Fontenelle. Fontenelle had a lot of penetration about Hamel's abilities. The Academy needed a secretary who understood and could speak the languages of the different savants, the language of a chemist, for example, and that of an astronomer, who could be the interpreter for the public, who could give to such difficult and abstract matters a certain clarity and a certain style. And finally, who was by his temperament exempt from all partiality and up to give a disinterested account of the academic disputes. Interestingly, Fontenelle remarks the conciliatory character of Hamel's philosophy. This is the slide 4 in French. Hamel approached with the same indulgence some scholastic concepts, for example, the substantial forms, but when as far as the laws of motion are concerned, for example, or the precepts of chemists, he was slightly inclined towards experimental philosophie. Aux lois du mouvement ou aux principes moins simples établis par les chimistes, on sent que malgré l'envie d'accorder tout, il laisse naturellement pencher la balance de ce côté-là. He avoided general notions, concepts, and words, and went into details. Fontenelle says. Voilà son inclination, le rappelle toujours à la philosophie expérimentale. Slide 5. Then Hamel continued to serve as a secretary of the Academy until 1697, with a break between 1668 and 1669. And having retired, he wrote its history. Regius Scientiarum Academiae Historia. There are 2 editions. The second one was enlarged. 1701. In this work, in the chapter 1 of the Sectio Secunda de Physicis Laboribus, Hamel gives a classification of experiments in general physics after Baconian fashion. This is the quote in Latin. In the middle, this is Academy. Academy, the French Academy, experimenta cum plura facienda judicavit non fructuosa solum qualia mechanici artifices potissimum querunt sed etiam lucida quad causas rerum invenientas plurimum conferunt. This would suggest that the Academy's experimental methodology, and this on the retrospective account of its historian, was Baconian. But it should be taken with some caution, because Hamel's it shouldn't be taken entirely at its face value for various reasons. First, Hamel's influence on the academy was limited, and furthermore, to an extent, he may have projected his own views on the academy's policy. And this is slide 6. In the Hamel's earlier treatise, De Mente Humana, this title specifically in the chapter about induction in general, we find a strikingly similar passage, with the difference that it is not the academy that conducts lucida experimenta, but the philosopher, slide 7. But the biggest difference between a philosopher and a mechanical artificer is that while the former searches most of all for the light of truth, the latter for the practical application of his work. Naturally, he conducts experiments for no other reason than that they serve a specific work. But a philosopher does not usually conduct profitable experiments, but lucid experiments that are less deceptive and especially contribute to inventing the causes of things. Just the same, only the philosopher instead of academy. Slide 8. This is part of the Hamel's larger project, logic suited not only for the old philosophy, but also for the new experimental philosophy. In the Ratio Operis, he writes, logicam non veteri modo philosophiae, sed etiam nove et experimentali accommodatam tradere nobis in animo fuerit. He writes that this is because he will go into details concerning induction, fuse et copiose, and perhaps his logic may look just like a sort of manual for experimental philosophy, because there are many examples of that kind. If the next part of this paper, I will concentrate on the place of induction in the Hamel's logic as compared to traditional scholastic humanist manuals and to Baconian induction. Then I will try to single out some eclectic conciliatory characteristics of the Hamel's style of thinking, together with his penchant for experimental philosophy, as described by Fontenelle. Induction, as slide 9. Thank you. Induction, sometimes called inverse syllogism, for example, by Melanchthon and many others, was considered less reliable but easier than syllogistic reasoning. Oh, just a moment, I'm lost. I lost my document. Easier than syllogistic reasoning, proper and therefore suitable for those fitted with plebeian minds. Johannes Sturm writes about this, namely philosophers provided with more capacity should deal with syllogisms, but quivero plebeo ingenio predicit sunt, with plebeian mind, this should be taught induction. Bacon confirms this disparaging view of traditional humanists and scholastic dialecticians still before saying goodbye to the puerile form of induction that consists but in simple enumeration. He underlines the feature it shares with its improved version, Inductio Vera. This means inseparable connection to invention. In that both kinds of induction differ from syllogism. Slide 10. I think this is quite very well known here, just to remind. Bacon says, ad quatenus ad judicium quod fit per inductionem nihiles quod nos detinere debeat, uno siquidem eodem quementis opere illud quod queritum et invenitur et judicatur. So this is the same act of judging, inventing and judging at the same time in the case of invention. And the quote 11, slide 11. Also inductio vera is so to say universal in the sense it belongs to judgment and invention. Et inductio ad inventione demonstrationem scientiarum et artium erit utilis naturam, and separare debet per reactiones et exclusiones debitas. Against this background, Hamel's concept of induction displays interesting shifts. Together with syllogism, induction is part of analytics as opposed to dialectics with its traditional loci dialectici. Slide 12. Loci dialectici are common to all disciplines, but analytics is not. Analytics is specific for every discipline, and the definition is interesting. Omnis penna argumentatio analytica syllogismo constant vel inductione. Syllogismus ad docentum, inductio ad inveniendum aptio. So induction self-invention. Slide 13. This is the same distinction. Quaestio alias dialectica quod problema vocitatur, alia vero analytica, and quique discipline propria. And then Hamel discusses traditional Aristotelian loci from rhetorics and topica. As I said, remarkably why syllogism self-teaching induction is all about invention. On the Hamel's account, the usage of both dialectical loci and syllogisms is limited. In a way, there are even an offense to the quickness of thought that is too brilliant to need such props. Slide 14. This is quite common criticism. For example, orators who would like to divert don't use syllogism because full form is simply redundant. And this passage, nec quicquam magis animum offendit quam circuitius ille verborum nulla res subjecta. It's entirely useless because mind is much quicker, motus animi celerimus. Slide 15. Lucid principles, principia lucida, are more important than syllogisms as such. Through them, syllogisms are made redundant. Dum vero certa erunt et perspicua si termini quibus tanquam materia constant clare perspiciantur, si distinctas in mente ideas efforment. So the form of syllogisms is not that important for reasoning. By way of digression, it is worth noting that this argument about the speed of thought was common and useful for very different purposes. For example, in the manual of dialectic by Pedro da Fonseca, Jesuit humanist, it says avoiding infinite regress of concepts. The mind can jump from one to another, and then it's no danger to fall into the abyss of infinite regress. But of course, this similar thought is to be found in Locke and, for example, in Leibniz in a different context. So for the Hamel, it is mathematics and not syllogistic that is better tool for disciplining thought, and therefore pupils should start with it before entering the realm of logic. Slide 16, it's interesting quote. Mathematics is a basis. Non nihil abies opere mathematicis disciplinis dari oportere, puisquam sad logicam aut philosophiam serio conferant. While syllogistic and dialectic are obsolete to some extent, induction is not. Descartes and his followers limit themselves almost exclusively to analytics, but when transferred from mathematics to physics, analytics is unreliable, fluxa et incerta, without induction. Slide 16. This is the Hamel criticizes Descartes quite often. This is one example. Descartes' analysis is too limited. Cum tantum atulerim ut ostenderem analysim in physicis fluxam esse et incertam nisi inductione ipsa firmetur. Consequently, Hamel questions the reliability of Descartes' laws of motion that are not received from nature or invented, but made out ex cogitate. Iste motum leges non tam a natura accepte aut invente quam ex cogitate videantur. In particular, he has doubts if it's possible. Okay, yeah, of course. Yeah. In particular, he has doubts if it's possible to derive the law of inertia from God's immutability. And this is slide 18. Consistently with his conciliatory approach, Hamel does not give up the concept of the direct divine legislation foreign to the modern concept of the laws of nature. However, he avoids resorting to the prime cause if it's not absolutely necessary. Instead, he prefers Principia Mechanica as an explanatory tool. As the next quote. Hamel substantiated the concept of mechanis affectiones, for example, in the discussion about the origin of qualities. Here we clearly see a subtle shift towards experimental philosophy as observed by Fontenelle. And the most important thing I have some exams for chemistry. It's just he interprets the Hamel follows, for example, Klauber comparing induction to arithmetic addition and syllogistic to subtraction, while e.g. for Hooke, arithmetic is generally more demonstrative than inventive. However, his concept of locus loci of induction, like that of the form of heat and fluidity that allows one to find a cause for the infinite number of effects, that seems similar to Hooke's and Boy's philosophical algebra. And it's visible, we can see it in the Hamel's nuanced understanding of lucidity and the aforementioned lucid experiments. So I will skip it over. Some remarks. The refined category of lucidity lies at the core of the Hamel's understanding of Baconian experimental lucida that provide data for inventive induction. This explains why, differently from Boy, he kept a sharp distinction between lucid experiments and profitable ones. Invention is a necessary tool for analytics, and interestingly, the Hamel defines induction as locus, but removes it from dialectical loci that do not go beyond probabilistic reasoning. And then he makes it more demonstrative. Topical induction, as defined in experimental logic, functions as a proof in a scholastic style argumentation. To sum up, Hamel is not the only one who gives a new lease of life to the concept of locus. He treats induction as locus, but for him induction changes its place. For example, Boyle treats experience as a locus whence arguments can be drawn. As Edith Silla shows, also Jacob Bernoulli's law of large numbers can be interpreted as a kind of locus a posteriori. It is interesting to observe how ancient concepts change their place and contribute to developing new ones, like modern induction or objectivity. Thank you very much, and I apologize for all these problems. I'm really sorry.
Thank you, Hanna. That's how we are functioning nowadays, fighting.
Yeah.
Yeah. So yes, thank you so much. Thank all of you. We still have some time for questions. So please do feel free to ask questions. If I'm going back on the chat, we had a question from Dolores and then one from Bill Eaton. And then I'm just recording the others who want to talk. So Dolores.
Thank you, Doina, for a wonderful lecture, and it fills me with. Can you hear?
Yes.
Oh, sorry. Okay, so it's encouraging to me that you're seeing the same things in Bacon that I'm seeing, and that you think that the medical alchemy is ignored, or it's not ignored because, of course, it's written about, but there isn't really any detailed full study of it. So I have a kind of complicated question, because it's not just about Bacon, but it's Bacon looking backwards and looking forwards in relation to alchemy and medical alchemy. So the specific question is, to what extent do you think the debate in the late 16th century about the relationship between chemistry and medicine, which is produced an entire flood of pamphlets and essays and books, was really the starting point for Bacon, which engaged with the writings of Paracelsus, but also Joseph Duchesne and people like that. So he is it in your view he's taking from these people and then, as Graham Rees says, sort of putting it in a mixture and making a semi-Paracelsian cosmology out of which his matter theory comes, which is then inherited by Boyle and von Helmont, and looking at things like not just chemical medicine, but actually the Alchemists and a universal medicine. So I guess my ultimate question is, to what extent is all of this a background and a prerequisite for strategies in Bacon for the prolongation of life? It would make sense of his cryptic remarks in the De Augmentis book 4, chapter 2, when he says, you know, I want to introduce prolongation of life as a completely separate research area that has never been studied before. So do you see this kind of what you're talking about in your presentation is as connected to prolongation of life and ideas about a universal medicine or the alchemist?
Thank you so much, Dolores. So your questions are really interesting. Now, about how he used alchemy, this is a bit complicated as it is with all of Bacon's sources, because he doesn't mention them, and he also modifies a lot. I have no doubt that he read several alchemical treatises. Now, what exactly he took and from whom, I think it's a bit complicated to decide. And you also, all right, about matter theories, I'm not sure whether we can say, well, he has this semi-Paracelsian matter theory, as Rees says, which I agree with, and it went to Van Helmont through Bacon. I think Van Helmont, for instance, read Paracelsus and several Paracelsians himself. So I'm not saying there is a very clear way through Bacon. It might be, but this is definitely not the only, even if that's the case, he's not the only Paracelsian source. And I also think Bacon's matter theory is also influenced by a lot of other traditions, and not only the Paracelsian. So in any case, it's not like he developed his, what we can call chemical alchemical experiments, like the ones we looked at, and he used only one matter theory, or he used experiments only from one person. We know that he's extremely eclectical. So it's complicated on all levels to decide. And about your last point, so Bacon was against the idea of a universal medicine. So in this thing, definitely he's not a Paracelsian, but at the same time, Boyle was also against this idea of a universal medicine. So maybe Boyle was influenced by Bacon. Again, I think it's difficult to establish. Whether this is related to the prolongation of life, yes and no. So I think we share this idea that the prolongation of life is one of Bacon's aims, maybe the biggest one. But I have no doubts that he also performed experiments and collected experiments that are not necessarily connected to this. So I think we can see them as really maybe useful for something else, since he's talking a lot about medicines to cure diseases and this kind of thing. So maybe they are for the prolongation of life, but again, not necessarily. I think he was interested in a lot of things. Some experiments would be, of course, connected to that, and most of them from Historia Vitae et Mortis. But for the rest, yeah, they can have different uses. I don't know if I answered your complex question.
I would like to intervene with some simple questions, if I may, before passing the word to Biliten. I was wondering whether we can go back to the theme of our session tonight, which is experiments on light. And I'd like to ask basically three very simple questions to all three members of the panel. One is, who does the experiments on light? Because from what we have heard, seems to be a very interesting distinction between the three philosophers you have discussed. In some cases, experiments of light seem to be the appanage of the philosopher. In some other cases, experiments of light are there to be done by everyone, natural historians, practitioners, and so on. So that would be the first question. So who does the experiments of light? Are experiments of light context dependent? And do experiments of light disclose causes by themselves? Or they can also disclose causes by means of mediated hypotheses or theories. And I would like perhaps each of the participants to the panel to give an answer to this, either the three questions or some of the questions, as many as you want to answer.
I can start.
Please
Since
do.
I was the first presenter. So for Bacon, I think everyone who is engaged in natural philosophy is doing some kind of experiments of light. And for the next two questions, I think it really depends on the experiment. And Dana, you better than anyone else here knows how many types of experiments there are in Bacon. And definitely some of them will be context dependent, some of them would maybe not. Some of them would disclose more occult causes, some of them not so much. Some of them will answer to a hypothesis, some of them will be exploratory, and again, so you know a lot about this.
Can I go next? There was the yeah.
Yes.
So the first question, it's a very decent question, and maybe the most appropriate answer would be we don't know yet, because we don't know because the philosophical algebra is something that Hooke never perfected. But by the look of what we have, the dilemma would be something like this. So the whole natural state, present state of natural philosophy is addressed, as far as I can see, to the natural historian. I'm not sure where the natural philosopher comes into play. But again, it's not, also in Bacon, it's not clear where the philosopher comes into play. And you know, so as the thing is, as you read through Hooke's present state, you tend to see that the experiments become more and more Luciferous. So you tend to say that the philosopher should be involved more and more, but I'm not sure if that happens. So at the end, this is how the text finished. So far, I only discussed as a historian, and the second part of my philosophical algebra would be addressed to the philosopher. Then to the question if the experiments are context related, I would say that again it depends, but probably the short answer is yes. But then, so it's very clear that for Hooke, hypotheses play a very important role. But I don't think we totally know which one. So I would refrain for saying anything further. So and the answer is yes, but then you will have to clarify a lot of other things. The most important of which would be, what do you mean by hypothesis?
Great. Hanna, do you have an answer?
Okay,
too?
yeah, it's my dear Amel, as you may expect, didn't reject hypotheses, of course, and they play an important role in his project, but he wanted to eliminate a language, so to say, foreign to natural philosophy. For example, moral qualities ascribed to things like sympathies, antipathies, and so on. So he wanted to turn natural philosophy into more project, more mechanical. And then he thought distinguish between different kinds of experimenters. For example, I have a quote: "Imperita plebs, inexperienced cloud, who considers causes literally like something that one can see or touch with hands." So, of course, he rejected such an approach. And on the other side, there were scholastic subtleties. And he writes even ironically that many philosophers deal with things that are inconceivable even with the intellect. So I think lucid experiments, he thinks lucid experiments are to be conducted by natural philosophers who are prepared because they have to devise them. I mean, to think how to draw axioms from them as a kind of loci, perhaps the locus of induction, and then afterwards to based on this axioms, they are able to make prepare another experiments just to enlarge given art or science. So I don't know if I answered your question.
Thank you, Hanna. Billy then has a question.
Oh, this is for the first presenter, Doina-Cristina. And thank you for just a fascinating presentation. But it's really just a question of clarification. A lot of early moderns like Descartes and Boyle think there's just one universal type of matter. But from parts of what of your presentation, it almost sounds like Bacon thinks there are ultimately genuinely different kinds of matter. And so I just wanted you to clarify that.
Yeah, thank you very much. So yeah, I also read the question in the chat. For Bacon, there is only one kind of matter, indeed, and this can be seen in the fact that tangible and pneumatic change into one another. But it seems that there might be something indeed like in Boyle, that some matter is just tangible and cannot be made more subtle or divided or break down, as you put it here. So for Bacon, there is tangible matter only in the center of the earth, and probably there we can find pure tangible matter. And we can't really know much about it since we don't have access to it. And you also say that, yeah, so in principle, it could be brought down by God. Bacon doesn't get into these discussions. So
Sure.
He's only talking about what's possible with natural means.
But I take it someone like I take it someone like Paracelsus would think there really are three or still different kinds of matter. So,
Yes,
so the influence on Paracelsus doesn't quite go that far.
Yeah, no, for Bacon, so oily passes into watery and the other way around. So he does have this Paracelsian language, but they are transmutable. It might be still that some things are not. So ultimately, some might be impossible to change.
It's just fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Omar Del Nono has a question.
Hi, thank you. Thank you for all the speech. I have a question for Doina. In general, it's a general question. When you was talking about the importance of the experiments that you explained to us, you refer to the importance also for biochemical approaches. Did you have in mind something specific, some experiments that Boyle did, or because my question actually was inspired from the I don't know much about Boyle, but I'm working on Spinoza, and there is a letter that he exchanged with Boyle, and is on Nietzsche and on the separation problem from the fixed part of Nietzsche and the spirits. And I was asking me if you had some more some idea about about the experiments, or your was a general remark.
It was quite a general remark, but I do think it might be very useful to have a look at Boyle's discussion in his small treatises on volatile, the nature of volatile, yeah. And there might be some connections. Now, of course, I'm not sure Boyle would have taken things from Bacon. I also don't think it's impossible that that's the case. And Bacon talks a lot about Nietzsche and the spirits in Nietzsche. So that can be indeed a source, but also Boyle had a lot of sources. So that's also difficult to trace down sometimes. So yeah, it was more general about placing Bacon in this history of alchemical chemical concepts.
Right. Dolores has a question. Dolores, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay, sorry, I don't want to, I mean, if anyone else has a question, they should, of course, do this, but I was very pleased to hear your thesis, Alexandru, because you do something which is really, really interesting. From Serrana's work, we know that Hooke is very much influenced by Bacon's medicine of mind. But in your opinion, do you think that in Hooke's general scheme or ideas of the present state of natural philosophy is actually trying to dissect the whole experimental methodology that is presented in Bacon, systematically going through prerogative instances, solitary and migratory instances? So he's trying to do something really very systematically analytical.
Thank you so much for this. Well, of course, I will start by a general remark, and then I will try to answer your specific question. So, of course, this text was, of course, seen as the epitome of Hooke's Baconianism, and this happens in a lot of ways. And I just wanted to add something to this. Now, of course, my thesis needs, I mean, it's a lot more work to do on this. It just, they were just the first thoughts that I had comparing the two, because I was reading Hooke, and they struck me as very similar to what
when you
Bacon
talk about,
does.
when you talk about, when you focus on the language of more secret ways of discovery,
Yes.
That kind of language is using an inductive method for discovery, not syllogistic, but it's also playing with the language of the vexing of nature. So these secret ways are supposed to be instances of the vexing of nature, which make it very which make a good argument against someone like Carolyn Merchant or something like that. So.
The problem is that I haven't really, so the secret ways, I haven't talked about the secret ways. Or I only talk about the more plain, more visible ways. So there are also, there are 3 secret ways, and there are, I don't know, 7 examples of the secret ways. But there are things like one secret way of discovery would be, for instance, if we manage to find out how our imagination worked mechanically, for instance. And this is what I took to be too complicated to address here, so I didn't delve into this. I just, so I basically I've chosen the more simple and obvious examples for this. So this is why I'm saying it has to be, I have to do more on this. And of course there is, I believe, of course there is this influence from the medicine of the mind, because you mentioned Solana's work. But this I also, in some way, also take to be an influence of the prerogative instances, because so when you go through the prerogative instances, you always find these warnings that some prerogative instances might lead you too much towards the affirmative way of inquiry, which is not what we need. So you have to be cautious. And this is what Hooke takes. This is certain that Hooke takes from Bacon.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you too. You're muted, Anna.
Sorry, I was just asking people whether they have any other questions or whether we are done for tonight. If there are no more questions, then let's thank our speakers for this session, which went well despite all the technical troubles that everyone encountered. And I will pass the word to Dan Garber, who wants to make an announcement.
Great, thank you very much. I just want to call your attention to a post that I put on the chat about the New York City workshop in early modern philosophy, which is meeting this weekend. I put up the URL so that you can get the full program and information about how to get a Zoom link. It's organized by Ohad Nachtomi, who's a regular participant, as well as Reed Winiger and Lauren Kopacik. It looks like a great program. You should look at the program and come to as many of the talks as you can. Donna, why don't you mention also the Spinoza session?
Okay.
For those of you who want to join us for the Philosophical Cafe on Friday at the same time, 8 o'clock in Bucharest, 1 p.m. in Princeton, Stephen Nadler and Dan Garber are going to debate Spinoza's ways of living and dying on the margin of Steve Nadler's recent book. So join us for that as well. And next week we are talking about friendship with God. So until then, all the best.
Thank you very much.